Today we're going to figure out what other characters might be the child of a God's Knight, because the origins of Shanks and Shamrock have shown us that not only do the God's Knights have kids outside of Marijois, but sometimes one might fall through the cracks when they come back to retrieve them. And at least in the case of Shanks, it later resulted in one becoming an Emperor of the Sea. So that left me wondering, are there other secret orphans of the God's Knights out there, and could this explain why certain characters are so powerful? Because while we don't know the full logistics of how the God's Knights operate yet, Garling has at least given us somewhat of a template, where he was out on business scoping out God Valley, he met Shanks' mom, and then tried to pick up his kids later when they came back to cleanse the place. And even Gunko seems like she probably went through a similar thing, because we saw her as a child with Brooke way back when, then she went through something horrible where she cried and yelled father, and then later became a God's Knight in the Man-Mayor family. So she probably followed the same process as Shamrock, where a Man-Mayor God's Knight visited Brooks Island, had Gunko, then came back later, maybe cleansing the place, and took her back. And since there were cleansings every 3 years, and honestly Garling didn't even seem all that invested in his kids, as he didn't know he had twins until he arrived, there's gotta be at least some children out there who managed to escape before the God's Knights could retrieve them, and then later became a big shot like Shanks did. And this probably isn't the only circumstance that these kids can originate from either. Like, take Bonnie for example. While we haven't had her biological father confirmed just yet, we know it was at least some celestial dragon, and it being Shamrock or Garling seems like a pretty good bet, because she looked a lot like Shanks when Oda drew her as a male. And obviously she became a big shot as well, because she was one of the supernova at just 12 years old. So that's why I think there's gotta be at least a few more secret God's Knight children out there. And while there are a lot of fun possibilities for this, we're just gonna stick to my top 5 options today so we can stay as realistic as possible. But if there are any that you think I should have mentioned, then definitely let me know down below. But first up, we have what I consider to be the most likely of all the options, which is the one and only Dracule Mihawk. I mean, who better to be related to the Holy Knights than the world's strongest swordsman? And a man that has a special connection to Shanks, no less, who is obviously related to the God's Knights. Especially when you consider how similar Mihawk's eyes are to Emu's, even being colored red in the official colored manga. Now, why is there a discrepancy with the anime, and which one are we supposed to believe? I'm not really sure, but it does make you wonder, could Mihawk just be related to Emu, potentially being part Nerona? Now, obviously he doesn't have to for this whole theory to work. In fact, I think it's a bit unlikely, and there are plenty of other God's Knights we still need to learn about anyway, but I guess it is possible. And we also saw that Gunko got Emu eyes when she got taken over, which just makes you draw that connection to those eyes in the God's Knights even more. And since Mihawk is literally called Hawkeye Mihawk, we know his eyes are a very, very important feature in the One Piece world. So being related to Emu or the God's Knights is definitely on the table. I mean, Mihawk even wears a cross around his neck, which is perfect for someone relating to the Holy Knights, as well as the Celestial Dragons, who all have Saint in their names. Yoru is also shaped like a cross, as was Mihawk's personal ship. And I think we can gather some pretty important context just by looking at this image of Mihawk as a child, because we can see that he looks rather disheveled, with torn clothes and scratches everywhere, and this tells us that he didn't grow up in the best of situations. Could this maybe be because his island went through a cleansing like Shanks' island did, but he made it out somehow? Or perhaps they were just poor from the Celestial Tribute because they actually agreed to work with the government instead. Because we saw with God Valley that they had a chance to join the world government 2 years before they decided to cleanse the place, but they refused. So I would imagine that at least some islands throughout history just took them up on the offer instead, which would then leave little money for the actual needs of the people, which we have seen on other islands before in One Piece. And because the God's Knights visited at all, there would still be a chance for them to have some children while they were there, but if they didn't have to come back and cleanse it later, that would definitely pave the way for some of those kids to just leave and start their own life. And I think the best part about Mihawk being related to a God's Knight is how Mihawk and Shanks would mirror each other even more, because their connection has already been a big point of intrigue in the story. They would have great sword duels that even Whitebeard would hype up, and even though they stopped battling, Mihawk was the one who decided to seek Shanks out to deliver Luffy's first bounty poster after they met. Oda clearly has an important story to tell with these two, and with Shanks being the son of a God's Knight who even went up to Mihawk for a while, what if Mihawk basically has the same situation? What if Mihawk is where their rivalry began? Could that just be the origin of their friendship? Because while we don't know exactly why Shanks decided to go up there, we do know that he ultimately decided to leave and live down on the blue sea with everyone else. And maybe Mihawk just did the same thing. I mean, he was already a warlord, so we know he's not completely against working for the world government. So they could have just met while they were up there and became like rivals in the God's Knight Academy or whatever they used to train and brainwash their knights. Maybe with both of them acting like young prodigies. But perhaps they ultimately decided that Mihawk wasn't the right place for him and they both left for a bigger adventure. And the reason why I believe Shanks definitely spent some time training to be a God's Knight, or at least learning their ways, is because of the tattoo we saw on his elbow. A tattoo which may just be the mark of the abyss, which is necessary for people to use the pentagrams. Now, Summers did have a different tattoo on his elbow, so maybe different marks mean different things, or maybe the mark expands or changes as you rise the ranks in the God's Knights, but either way, the fact they're on the same elbow is pretty interesting, and I think this is going to prove to be very, very important because that's the very same arm that Shanks lost. And after Shanks lost that arm, Mihawk refused to battle him anymore. We were led to believe that it's just because Shanks lost his dominant arm and he's weaker than he once was, but what if it's deeper than that and Shanks actually lost some God's Knight powers? Ones that Mihawk might still have if they got that same mark while in Mihawk. I mean, if this mark granted regeneration powers, for example, and then Mihawk was the only one of the two who could still do it, that would be significantly less fair than just the arm which was already significant, and that kind of paints this whole situation in a brand new light. And then the last point that I want to make here about Mihawk being a God's Knight child is how this could act as a very fun inversion with Zoro, because up to this point in the story, the two strongest groups of dedicated swordsmen that we've really met are the samurai and the God's Knights. And sure, some of the God's Knights don't even primarily use a sword. I mean, Killingham has a trident, which is kind of close, I guess, but at least a knight traditionally uses a sword, and so do the leaders of the God's Knights, like Garling and Shamrock. So I think it still counts. And with Zoro being tied to the Wano samurai, being a descendant of the Shimotsuki clan who left Wano 55 years ago and founded Shimotsuki village, wouldn't it kind of make sense for Mihawk to be a descendant of the opposite group? Because then their fight would almost be more about which group of swordsmen are really the best. And there's also a hell versus heaven theme here as well, because Zoro has had a hell or demonic theme to him from the very beginning, where now he's even going as far to call himself the King of Hell, and the literal name of the Holy Knights or God's Knights inherently implies some sort of divinity, as does the saint in their names, which we talked about earlier. Plus, Mihawk is even way up in the clouds, which sort of signifies all of this. It's like they're up in heaven, I guess. So the duel between Zoro and Mihawk might be more than just about Zoro's personal goals or even Mihawk's desire for someone to surpass him, but also something that builds on the past, because we know that the Wano samurai were already on Joy Boy's side back then, but obviously the government came out on top. However, at some point in the future, Luffy and his crew are obviously going to flip that narrative. And this actually reminds me of what we saw during Oda's one-shot called Monsters as well, because there we had Ryuma, who already ties to Zoro, take down both a dragon and a man named Shirano, who looks quite a bit like Mihawk. And while originally Shirano was looked up to by everybody, he was actually just putting on a front about being some honorable swordsman who helped the citizens, because he was really the exact opposite, as he basically used the threat of the dragon as a cover to loot all the townspeople. So I wonder if this is going to play into the lore behind Zoro versus Mihawk as well. Not that Mihawk is going to be as dishonorable as Shirano, but maybe he comes from a dishonorable family like the Celestial Dragons, which could be why Oda had Ryuma take down both Shirano and a dragon as well. And before we finish this section up, I did want to mention that there have been theories for years now about Mihawk potentially being the son of Rayleigh and Shaggy, which I was personally a big fan of, but I don't think that theory is very likely anymore after the recent flashback, because Rayleigh and Shaggy didn't really get together until God Valley, which happened 5 years after Mihawk was born. Now, technically, Oda did skip from 44 to 42 years ago in the flashback, and Mihawk was born 43 years ago, so technically it could still work if Shaggy had like gone to Hachinosu right after having Mihawk, Mihawk, but I think it'd be pretty weird for her to have left that note for Rayleigh and for him to say he's not interested and doesn't want to be tied down if they were really having a secret baby together at the time, just as it probably would if she abandoned her newborn and didn't seem to be all that worried about it. So all things considered, Mihawk is probably the best candidate right now to be the child of a God's Knight in my estimation. But the next character on our list is actually Nami, and at first this might come as a bit of a surprise, but I think it actually makes a lot of sense because we already know that her home island of Oikot went through some major conflict that left her orphaned, and it was also one that had a heavy marine presence just as God Valley did, so maybe Bellmare filled almost a similar role to Dragon, where they saved a child who was destined to be taken back to the Holy Land. And here's another thing about Nami. She's already shown one key trait that children of celestial dragons seem to have, which is a fondness for money and riches, because just a few chapters ago we saw Shanks crawl right towards the spilled treasure at God Valley as a baby. When the Don Quixote family left Marijois, we saw Doflamingo dive right into a chest of treasure in their new home, and Bonnie is literally named Jewelry Bonnie, which yes, that is because of when she had sapphire scale, but she still came to love those sapphires. So in all three cases, you have a child who is at least related to a celestial dragon, but loves money and or jewelry. So I think Nami's love for that stuff is a pretty strong foreshadow that she's at least related to a celestial dragon, and like I said, a God's Knight might make some sense because her home island also got attacked. And we might even have a good guess as to which God's Knight that could be, because Saint Shepard Summers was just revealed to have orange hair on the cover for volume 113, and with him being a central figure to the Elbaf arc right now, maybe this is all building up towards a major reveal that he is truly her father. Now, whether he is or not, I think this theory can still stand, but the fact he has orange hair is pretty interesting, I think, and with a lot of the Marines being dead during the Oikot incident, almost including Bellmare, that would also imply that the government faced some pretty serious opposition there. Maybe this was just the army of Oikot who was protecting their citizens, or maybe it's similar to God Valley where pirates made a surprise entrance and kind of ruined their event, which would also mean that there's a lot more to that situation than we know of now. But with how important Nami is to the overall story, Oda probably does have something special in store there. And I also want to add that just as we saw Saturn being at God Valley, I imagine every cleansing had a Gorosei in attendance just to at least supervise in case things got out of hand, I guess. And if Oikot did get cleansed, then I think the Gorosei that would be there was V Nostro. Now, why would he be the supervisor? Well, he is the warrior god of finance, which would be something right down Nami's alley, right? And perhaps that's also a hint as to why the government even wanted to take over Oikot. We know they chose God Valley because it had some important resources, but maybe Oikot was just generally wealthy. That would also explain why Nami loves money and jewelry so much. Or another option is that Oikot might have just had some really good sake, which could also explain their wealth if they sold it, but this is because Nami has an absurdly high alcohol tolerance. This is also one reason why I've theorized before that she's gonna fight Vasco Shot in the future, because he obviously has the sake fruit, and I'll link that video down below in case you're interested. But now I will say, if there was one reason to doubt that Nami is related to a God's Knight, it's that she isn't necessarily physically strong, especially compared to some of the other characters we've talked about. I mean, she's always been in the weakling trio for a reason, but Sanji did mention that her body held up well in Punk Hazard while he was stuck inside of it, and we also saw Jinbei thought that she had conquerors before. We've always kind of taken it as just a gag when she's been able to hurt the monster trio, but maybe it's all a hint that Nami has some sort of dormant power and she just hasn't discovered it yet. But as for our next candidate here, we have another one that might be surprising at first, but I also think this one makes a lot of sense, and that's Enel. Now, obviously he's got a lot of the personality traits we're looking for. He thinks he's a god, he doesn't care to wipe out entire islands, he's just an overall horrible person. But the thing that really piqued my interest about Enel is that the god of Skypiea before him later became a literal knight, even wearing a suit of armor and everything, which seems like a definite foreshadow at this point, especially taking into account all the other Enel and Emu parallels. And we were actually told that a Sky Knight opposed Enel back in Burka as well, but lost. This person still hasn't been revealed yet, and I sorta doubt that this would be a God's Knight given how strong they are, but it would be pretty crazy if Enel defeated one somehow, especially if it was his parent. But instead, I think this is probably just Yarouge, implying they have some sort of deep connection, or maybe it was just the leader of Burka at the time, thus paralleling Gon Dawnfall. And hey, maybe the fact that Oda tied Enel to these nights is just a fun foreshadow and nothing more, but I kinda doubt it because another thing I realized is that Shanks, Enel, and Buggy were all born 39 years ago. Now, we don't know of Buggy's origins just yet. There were a lot of theories about Rocks being his dad, but so far it seems Blackbeard is his only child. But Buggy would definitely fit as a candidate in this video too, because he loves treasure, he wanted to be pirate god, and he's always had this close connection to Shanks, who is obviously related to a God's Knight himself. So what if it wasn't just God Valley that the God's Knight scoped out 40 years ago, but instead they just visited a bunch of islands on the same single trip, and that's where these three came from? I mean, Garling did already say that he was out on another assignment whenever he stopped at God Valley, so we know he was out there doing other things as it is, and I think generally it would just make a lot of sense that the God's Knights would visit a whole bunch of different islands before they finally decided on which one they were going to cleanse. There seems to be some sort of selection process here that probably requires the information they're getting when visiting those islands. And even the way that Garling spoke to the Gorosei was as if he was recommending God Valley, thus indicating there were other options. And if that's the case, then what if Garling is just all of their dads? I mean, Enel even has the blonde hair. Now, I sorta doubt that Oda would go this far with it, but it would also mean that Buggy and Shanks are half brothers, which would be a very nice touch, I think. But either way, whether their dad is Garling or another God's Knight, this would tell us that those God's Knights made a stop at the Sky Island of Burka, and that's how we got Enel, which is a pretty cool plotline on its own because we have not heard of the world government contacting a Sky Island before, but you'd think they probably would have. Like, they definitely know they exist, right? And Burka specifically would make a ton of sense because in real life, Burka was a huge trading city during the time of the Vikings. So I've already been expecting some tie between Elbaf and Burka in the story, which could then bring my goat Yarouge and Enel back into the picture. But we also know that Harold was trying very, very hard to both establish trade with a bunch of different islands and also ally with the world government. And I think we're gonna find out that they had some special tie with Burka, at least before it got destroyed 8 years ago by Enel. Plus, there's already a lot of Skypiea themes being touched on here in Elbaf, so I think this is all gonna come full circle somehow. But then the question becomes, did Burka actually agree to work with the government like Harold was trying to, or did they refuse and thus faced a cleansing of some kind? Well, I kinda like the former a little more because not only would that be in line with what Harold was trying to do, but this could also be part of the reason that Enel destroyed Burka 8 years ago, because then he would have grown up in the version of Burka that had to pay the celestial tribute, meaning he would have struggled a lot early on in life and thus later fought back against the rulers he saw as evil. Plus, Oda has not drawn Enel as a child just yet, which I think is interesting because it might tell us a thing or two about him. But I also think that if the island was cleansed because they refused, you could almost follow the very same logic, because I doubt that every island that's been cleansed got outright erased like God Valley. That was probably a special situation, because there's usually something they want from the islands they're cleansing, like how they wanted the resources from God Valley. So maybe Burka had something they wanted that required the government subjugating them, kind of like how Enel used the Skypieans to build him stuff. So maybe Enel destroying Burka was both maybe a way to stop these evil rulers from subjugating them, but also a way to stop the government from benefiting from whatever they were getting. And honestly, now that I'm saying all of this, I feel like this could easily become its own separate Burka theory video, so maybe I will do that. But suffice to say, there's a pretty good chance that one of Enel's parents could be a God's Knight. But next we have Mr. Aramaki, aka Greenbull, and as for why he is maybe related to a God's Knight, well, for starters, we can make fun of him all we want after Shanks cooked him in Wano, but as an admiral, he's obviously extremely strong. He would not be in this position otherwise. Plus, he literally is a swordsman. I think we usually first think of his forest fruit when we think of his combat abilities, but he does have a sword as well. And the way that he wanted a pat on the head from Akainu shows us that he is a pretty straightforwardly violent or evil character, at least compared to some of the other admirals who have been varying levels of conflicted, like Kuzan, Fujitora, or Kizaru. Plus, when Greenbull was first introduced, he said that he hadn't eaten in 3 years, but he would if he was fed by a lovely woman, which was partially a foreshadow for his devil fruit because he can probably just photosynthesize, or at least drink by using his tree roots like a straw, but that also seems like the type of thing a celestial dragon would say, if you ask me. I mean, their grand prize realize that God Valley was literally a woman. So Greenbull's got the strength, he's got the personality, and maybe most importantly, he's got the look. Because he looks just like Don Quixote Mjosgard. And it's a pretty unique look as well, so I think they're definitely related. And Aramaki is 41, and Mjosgard is, or was, 35. So that could mean they might be like half siblings or potentially cousins, meaning the situation is probably something like one of Greenbull's parents are related to one of Mjosgard's parents, but they left Merigeois like Doflamingo's parents did, however Mjosgard's didn't. And I don't think this would all be on the Don Quixote side of the equation, because for one thing, Mjosgard's dad, Don Quixote Shiver Calero, looks nothing like them at all, and he stayed in Merigeois anyway. So this all probably revolves around Mjosgard's mom's side of the equation instead, meaning maybe his mom and one of Greenbull's parents are siblings. Now, the caveat here is that Mjosgard was just a regular celestial dragon and not a God's Knight. Perhaps this is because only certain members of each celestial dragon family become a God's Knight, and the rest just don't. Which could also tie into this clan trophy that they discussed during God Valley as well. Maybe every family designates a few members as a God's Knight to kind of represent them, or maybe this all means that Greenbull is just a regular celestial dragon instead. Either way, I feel like he's got a pretty good shot. But the next character on our list is Rob Lucci, supposedly the strongest and most cold-blooded killer in the history of CP9. Even since he was a child, he was viewed as a genius and one of their brightest prospects. And the reason I really like Lucci as a candidate here is because the God's Knights have not only been shown to be absurdly strong, but also very bloodthirsty. They have no empathy whatsoever for the people that they hurt. I mean, they had no qualms with erasing an entire island of people, even doing so every 3 years. Nor did they care to use the children of Elbaf as pawns in their game. And Lucci has been pretty much that very same way since he was young, because he was sent to go help a kingdom who had 500 soldiers taken hostage by a group of pirates, but Lucci just went there and killed all 500 of the soldiers. In the anime in SBS 45, he stated the reason was just that the soldiers were weak. They surrendered to evil, thus causing the kingdom a crisis, so he thought they all deserved to die. And then after this, he went and beheaded the captain of the crew as well, and that's why his sense of justice today is dark justice. And another thing is he's also been shown to be very loyal to the world government's cause, totally buying into and spreading the propaganda about them being gods who created the world. However, one time he did ignore his orders because he started fighting Luffy and Egghead, as Marines and Cypherpole are not meant to start fights with Emperors of the Sea, but he did so anyway. So this kind of shows that he has a certain level of arrogance as well. So I would say he at least has the natural born strength and temperament to be related to a God's Knight, and he's already working for the world government where he's now the head of CP0. So even though that's not quite a God's Knight, it's probably as close as you can get without being one officially, and maybe that's just cause he's related to one. And you know, going back to how Mihawk has emu eyes or something close to it, Lucci sort of did at one point as well, because during Water 7, Lucci wore this bull mask to hide his identity while they were getting the blueprints. And that thing had literal emu eyes. Now, I don't know if this is just a coincidence or some kind of Oda foreshadowing, but it does make you think. Could Lucci maybe get taken over at some point in the future like Gunko did? And another interesting thing about Lucci is that we don't really know anything about his origins. Like, his hometown on his Viver card is just the same island that Cypherpole agents are trained on when they're kids. And even in the CP9 cover story, we saw that they all seriously considered this place to be their hometown. But obviously they all had to come from somewhere else before that, and at least for Lucci, maybe Oda saving it because it somehow connects to the God's Knights. Now, there is somewhat of a small hurdle to jump over here when it comes to Lucci being related to a God's Knight, which is that if he is related to one, and he's always been working for and supporting the government, and has always been very strong, being one of their top prospects, then why isn't he just a God's Knight now? It seems like he kind of has the perfect resume. And I mean, they've even invited people from outside the Celestial Dragons to become God's Knights, like Loki, for example. So if one of the God's Knight's strong offspring came back ready to work, you would think that they'd let them, because kind of the whole premise of this video is that the God's Knights seem to go and retrieve their children later and then brainwash them to be knights. So if one just came back willingly, ready to do whatever they wanted, I don't see why they wouldn't get that promotion. Because sure, Doflamingo was rejected when he returned to the Holy Land, but he was just the child of a regular regular celestial dragon. I think a God's Knight would probably be a little bit different because we know that Shanks was able to return for a while. And now, sure, we don't know all the details on that yet either, but either way, this at least seems like the type of thing Oda would have to explain. But my first thought for Lucci is just maybe both the government and Lucci are oblivious to this. If they actually knew who he was related to, maybe they would have let him in. But because the government cleanses all these islands and they go and seek out orphans for Cypher Pole specifically, they might just not know who he really is at this point. Or perhaps they do know, but it's a God's Knight that has a tarnished reputation. I mean, with the way Lucci reacted to Mars talking about not saving Kaku, saying that you can't save a single insect when terminating the hive, his loyalty might be wavering a little bit as well at this point. And perhaps we're just gonna find out that he and his parents were on similar paths. Or maybe it's just that while Lucci was impressive, he wasn't Loki or Shanks levels of impressive. Honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if Shanks was welcomed back not because of who his family was, but because of how strong he was, which that might be because of his family a little bit, but regardless, maybe they only welcome back people that are useful to them in terms of their strength. So this might be why Lucci's instead been in the higher ranks of Cypher Pole, as it's kinda close to the God's Knights, but not exactly, and maybe later in the story he will get upgraded. But either way, I still think Lucci's a very good option here to be related to a God's Knight at the very least. So we have now gotten through my top 5 options, but while I was doing this video, there were a couple characters who came to mind whose cases were a bit less concrete, but still very interesting nonetheless, so I figured I'd just quickly mention them here as some honorable mentions. And first up, we have Crocodile. Now, a few years ago, I did a video about him being related to Rox, and it seems that's dead in the water at this point, unless Rox had a lot of secret children we don't know about, but I think a God's Knight also makes a lot of sense for Crocodile, because yeah, he lost a pre-time skip and pre-hockey Luffy, but generally speaking, he's still a pretty strong character overall in the narrative of the story, and maybe more importantly, he's a very cunning character. He's like a master planner, even to the point that he tried taking over an entire country, which is basically what the God's Knights do as well, but they tend to use a little bit more force, I guess. And you know, the country that he tried taking over was Alabasta, aka one of the kingdoms belonging to the original 20 kings, which is also something that Doflamingo did over in Dressrosa, except he was successful in taking them over until Luffy also showed up. And I feel like there's always been this kind of Crocodile and Doflamingo connection going on, like whenever they clashed in Marineford, it just felt like there's something more to it. Plus, you know, Crocodile was in level 6 but got released, and now Doflamingo is in level 6 and everyone thinks he's gonna get released eventually. So maybe this is all just because they're both related to celestial dragons. And yeah, Crocodile had his own reasons for taking over Alabasta, like getting Pluton for example. You could still kind of narratively look at this like he was taking over the island from who was probably the biggest traitor to the 20 kings back in the Void Century. And that alone kind of makes him like celestial dragon or God's Knight material, I think. Plus, you know, he's basically in the same exact position as Mihawk right now, being one of the wings of Buggy. And if Mihawk was related to a God's Knight like we talked about earlier, it could make a lot of sense that Croc is too. Then you could almost say that Buggy already has God's Knights working for him, which is yet another funny way that Buggy keeps falling upward. Now, we know very little about Crocodile's origin. We don't even know what island he was born on, other than it's somewhere in the Grand Line, and that's why I'm not as sure about this one, but I think it's a fun idea nonetheless. And then last but not least, at least in my opinion, we have Foxy. And the main reason that I think he could be related to a God's Knight is, for one, it would be hilarious. For two, we had this one panel with some celestial dragon delivering news to Saturn who looked kinda like Foxy from behind. And third, Foxy was born 38 years ago, the very same year as God Valley. So going back to what I said earlier about Enel, Shanks, and Buggy all being 39, maybe Garling and the God's Knights just went out for even more visits after we saw them talk about God Valley, and that's where Foxy came from and why he's 1 year younger than all of them. I mean, they probably would keep searching for an island until a decision was made, I would imagine. Now, just like Crocodile from earlier, we know almost nothing about Foxy's upbringing other than that he was born in the South Blue, so we're basically just taking a stab in the dark here, but with how important the Davy back fights have become since Rox also did them, Foxy might have a bigger role in the story than we thought after we saw him in Long Ring Longland. But alright guys, we finally reached the end of the video. If you enjoyed it, you know what to do. Make sure you hit like and subscribe, and let me know down below if there was any other characters that I missed who should have been brought up. I feel like there's probably some of them, and maybe I can do like a part 2 to this video, but either way, I hope you all have a great day, and I'll see you all next time.